It feels like Canada's gaslighting itself.
How do we make government work better?
Citizens should be mad that they can't see what government knows about them.
Digital identity has become a political conspiracy theory.
We do not have the government services we deserve. Welcome to the Functional Government Podcast. Ryan Androsoff is the VP of Learning and Leadership at the Institute on Governance and one of Canada's leading voices on digital government and public sector innovation. And there's no better guest for this first podcast. For over 25 years, Ryan has shaped how the public service adapts to technology. After defining things like the government's social media policies in the early 2000s, he co-founded the Canadian Digital Service. He ran Think Digital, a consultancy helping the public sector modernize, and was the host of the Let's Think Digital podcast. He's also been an advisor to Forward 50, a digital government conference I founded in 2017. In this chat, we talk about whether Canada is gaslighting itself by not realizing how far behind our government services are. We look at the risk of promising that AI will fix things without building solid foundations like digital ID. We tackle why procurement complexity paralyzes government. And we dig into the challenges of getting real data about how the services that Canadians pay for are doing. Hi, Ryan. How are you?
I'm great, Alistair. How about you?
Well, thanks. It's really good to see you. You've been a fixture of all the digital government stuff I've been involved in over the last few years, since the time I didn't know what ESDC or TBS or IOG or any of these other acronyms stood for. And you've been a reliable guide on that. Maybe for the folks that don't know you, tell us a little about who you are, maybe your journey from CDS to Think Digital to your role today at the Institute on Governance.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Alistair. And likewise, I was thinking back to the first Forward 50 conference, which I think was 2016, right?
2017.
2017. So yep. We're rapidly coming up on a decade since I would have first met you. And my passion for a long time really has been, and kind of a focus in my professional career, is just how do we make government work better, right? And in particular, how do we make government work better in this modern digital age that we're in? So these days, I'm the Vice President of Learning and Leadership at the Institute on Governance. IOG is a not-for-profit think tank based here in Ottawa, Ontario, but with a mandate really to improve how government works. And a big part of how we do that is through learning and leadership development programs, including a digital leadership program that I've been running with IOG for 7 years now. As you alluded to, I was in government before and spent a number of years in the federal government working on a variety of digital modernization initiatives, everything from the first social media policy guidelines to internal social media tools, to being one of the founders of the Canadian Digital Service, which is a digital services team that we launched back in 2017. And then since I left government, I've been doing a mix of consulting and training work, really just working with public sector organizations to help them think through how do they change how they work for this modern digital era? What's the leadership challenge around that? And so, excited to have done that through my company, Think Digital. We had a podcast for a number of years called Let's Think Digital, and now doing it through the Institute on Governance, helping public servants both here in Canada and internationally really think about, what does public service mean in 2025, and how do our institutions have to change to be able to get there?
So when you try and talk to these organizations and get them to think about digital transformation, what's the biggest resistance in your experience?
It's, the resistance, and I think it's almost has become a bit of a cliche in the digital government world, is that the technology is not the hard part, right? I think there are technical challenges, but a lot of it is, I think the kind of the operating system on a cultural and incentives and structures level just isn't aligned for how we want to work today, right? You think about your conception of, a modern, nimble organization that's taking a human-centered lens, that's being agile, and just the way that governments are structured and designed comes from a very different era, decades old in many cases, but really kind of the DNA, certainly of most governments here in Canada, are centuries old. Go way back. And so they're not designed at a very deep level for the kinds of speed and pace and scale of some of the challenges that we're facing today. And that's, the change management aspect of thinking about how do public sector organizations evolve themselves through the modern digital era. It's always a very, very tricky thing about this.
So I'm just looking for the quote. There's a Clay Shirky quote about product management that I think is amazing. I'm paraphrasing because I can't find it, but he says that using waterfall product manage or project planning, waterfall being the idea that like if you're going to build a battleship, you define the entire battleship from scratch on day one, and that's the commitment you're making to the budget, to the public, or whatever. He says that's just a promise not to learn anything.
Right. Yeah, and it's this, this tension between what people call waterfall and agile. And I often, when I talk about waterfall and some of the training we do, as the name describes, right, this idea that you can set all these requirements and then the specific tasks trickle down and you're able to build something. And I do think it's important to say, it's not that kind of traditional waterfall project management approach never applies, right? Like if you're building a battleship, if you're building a bridge, if it's a known problem with a known solution, that may actually, in fact, make sense as a way to approach it, in my view. But where we talk about agile, this idea of being iterative and learning a whole bunch, like that is important when we have a lot of unknowns and complex situations. And, when we talk about the world of kind of digital and digital services, that comes in there as well. But, it also equally applies in the world of policy development and in, frankly, like a lot of what government does, where exactly to your point on that quote, there's a lot of untested assumptions that are just kind of baked in. And what Agile tries to get you to do is to actually kind of test that with real world data in very quick, small ways so that you can learn much faster than you would otherwise when you have, a huge $100 million failure that you then have to spend years trying to clean up afterwards.
So I like that framing. You said a known problem with a known solution. And I've seen those 2x2 matrices of like known problem, known solution, just do the thing you know how to do because it works.
Yeah.
Known problem, unknown solution, you're going to have to experiment, try things out. And therefore your plan is a plan for how to find a solution that works. Unknown problem, unknown solution. That's kind of like, we think climate change is going to happen. We can't clearly identify what its consequences will be. So we first have to identify what the consequences are and then try and solve them. And of course, a known problem, known solution, that doesn't really seem like anything government should be involved in. It seems like if you started every project in government with saying, is this a known or unknown problem? Is this known or unknown solution? Most people would realize that in most cases, when you're moving to digital, because digital is relatively new, those are all unknown solutions. So is it like this weird trap where we're just unwilling to admit we don't know the solution because we aren't aware the world has changed in digital?
It's, I actually don't think it is as intentional as that. I actually think there's maybe a little bit of a deeper thing. And one of them is a lot of people who are in government, particularly at the public service layer of it, they're very solution driven and solution oriented, right? And a lot of the incentives in the organization are really about how do you kind of solve and implement and effectively be able to deliver. We don't actually, I find, in the public sector, spend a lot of time thinking about what the problem actually is. And that's the whole, when you kind of think about design thinking and design methodology, which I kind of view as the other side of the coin of agile, that's really about kind of spending the time to do the user research, to understand the problem space, to make sure you're solving the right problem first before you kind of jump into solutions. And there's a number of reasons for that. Again, I think our institutions are oriented that way. I think traditionally, and certainly if you kind of went way back to the origins of our political system, there was probably a bit of a sense that like the elected officials are the ones who are supposed to define the problem, and then the public servants simply go along and implement, right? That kind of old adage of loyal advice and fearless implementation, or fearless advice and loyal implementation. That might have been a bit of a Freudian slip there, but I actually wonder.
I'm still waiting for the fearless implementation, to be honest.
Exactly, fearless implementation. But I actually wonder if the world's gotten so complex that we can't assume that elected officials are going to be able to do all the problem definition themselves. I think that's where this whole idea of bringing kind of that design thinking, agile lens into government is really saying, in 2025, the scope of what government's dealing with, it's no longer feasible to say, you're going to have a minister sitting in parliament who's accountable for every last piece of what a department does. You have to actually empower the people in that department to be able to take some of that direction and implement it and be able to execute on it.
So, one of the reasons we decided to start this podcast, the world doesn't need another podcast. Think Digital was doing a great job. I love that podcast. But one of the reasons we decided to start it was I'm lucky enough to have traveled to a lot of other countries because I've been running conferences and things like that. And I've encountered many more of the digital services than other people have. At the start of the year, I published a book and we launched it through warehouses in Europe and in the US, in addition to traditional publishing venues. And I had to navigate the export of books to the Netherlands from England and to the US from England, and then navigate all of the EORI, VAT, EIN, all these other acronyms from multiple jurisdictions. And then I had to do it for Canada. And it was so Byzantine, so incredibly complex. I had to get multiple numbers for the CBSA, the Border Security Agency, for the CRA. Turns out some of those numbers are exactly the same as your GST number. They're just one letter different, but for some reason you have to go get them. I had to do a multi-day process where I enabled a shipping company to act as a shipper for me. It was like incredibly difficult. And at the same time, we were seeing the saber rattling to the south, suggesting that Canada had to get its economic house in order. And the drain that bad government services put on the productivity of a nation is just staggering. Whether you're talking about personal tax filing, billions of dollars a year to actually pay private sector companies to do your tax filing instead of having a working system, or no tax filing at all, as is the case in many parts of the world. I guess the reason that we started this podcast, and the question I want to ask you is, it feels like Canada's gaslighting itself. Like most Canadians have no idea how good government can be. I looked at a couple of pieces of data before this. In Ontario, if you want to renew a driver's license, it's a 4 to 6 week wait. In the UK, it's 5 days. In Canada, processing times for social benefit applications, their goal is to have 80% of claims processed within 28 days, and we often miss that goal. Meanwhile, in a place like Denmark, the processing times are almost instantaneous. Yeah. If you look at building permit approvals in Toronto, it's 249 days, over 8 months in 2020. And then you go compare this to, and that, by the way, puts Canada 34th out of 35 OECD countries for construction timelines. And then you go look at Finland, and it's like, oh, they were upset that it was taking 3 months, and they got it down to 1 month. Yeah. Why can't we have nice things?
Yeah. Yeah, listen, a lot to unpack there. And by the way, I see your book sitting over your shoulder, Just Evil Enough. Great book. People should read it. We had you on our podcast a few months back talking about it. No, and listen, and this is an issue. I mean, you mentioned Let's Think Digital. We kind of brought that podcast to a close a few months ago. The episodes are still up, and we interviewed a number of people from elsewhere in the world too to talk about some of this, because I think you're right. And one of the themes that really kind of came out last season, and we were talking about this at last year's Forward 50 up in Ottawa in 2024, was this idea that we kind of feel like we're stuck in the mud in Canada. And I think somewhat, infamously last year, there was a lot of discussion about Canada's ranking in the world in the UN's e-government index. This is a biannual index the United Nations puts out. They have since the early 2000s, looking at how countries are doing on what they're calling kind of e-government, right? Which has evolved really to what we call digital government today. And 15 plus years ago, Canada was a world leader. We peaked at third in the world according to their ranking in 2010. But then it has been a slow, steady, and actually increasing decline since then. And last year it came out that we were 47th in the world. And I think that was shocking to a lot of people, perhaps shouldn't be, because I think exactly to your point, it's not that things have gotten worse here in the last 15 years. It's that other places in the world have been able to move much faster than we have. And, when you look at that listing on the UN website, and there's other rankings you could use to be able to kind of look at it, but you've got an interesting mix of, European and Scandinavian countries, places like Estonia that always get talked about when it comes to digital, countries like Singapore, but also, jurisdictions like Ukraine, which has been able to digitally modernize very quickly in the face of adversity and crisis. Countries in the Middle East, but even places in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia.
Uganda has online registration and filing for taxes where the government already has your data and just sends you a tax return. That's Uganda.
Yeah,
And we often don't talk about China, but the reality is that WeChat is partly a government app because you're using WeChat to file stuff and pay stuff. It's all
absolutely.
built in. I gave a talk at the last Ford 50 event we did in April about government as product. And I kind of made fun of the UN digital rankings, not because Canada's done badly in them, but because they're incredibly complex. They're like
Mhm.
designed by committee. There's 180 different metrics and stuff. So I proposed a really simple metric, which is what percentage of your population, when they get a new phone, installs the government app on it? And people said, well, wait a minute, that's a little oversimplified, but I think you need continuous deployment and agile and QA and
Yeah,
accessibility and all these other things in order to ship an app at that scale. And it also shuts up some of the critics because, like in Brazil, 77% of the people who get a new phone install that app on it, and it's the government app. And
yeah.
that's the norm. Dia, same thing in Ukraine. That's the norm for so much of the world.
It is. No, you're absolutely right. And so, back to your kind of point about, are we kind of gaslighting ourselves in terms of where Canada's at? Yeah, I think there's a real failure of imagination. I think exactly to your point. I think on an individual level, when we're tourists in some places, we don't always tend to interact with kind of those core government apps. But I think if you spend any time there, certainly if you talk to locals or kind of understand, the way it works, we kind of quickly realize how fractured and how behind, frankly, a lot of our kind of digital government approaches are, where we're trying to solve problems, I think, that were problems 20 years ago that we haven't made a lot of progress on. I mean, I joined the federal public service in 2010, so 15 years ago now. And, being really blunt, if I kind of look at the issues that we were talking about back in 2015, we're using different language now, but it's primarily the same problem space that we're still trying to catch up to. And a lot of countries, to your point, are kind of jumping much further and much faster ahead around this. So I think we've got just, I think a bit of a failure of imagination of going beyond simply saying, how do we take our existing processes or existing services, kind of slap a layer of digital paint on them and consider them modernized, versus that kind of true digital transformation, which is saying, maybe we kind of rethink at a much deeper level how services and programs, even kind of policy development work. But I will say, I think what's challenging about that is we've not spent, in my view, the time we need to on what people are increasingly calling digital public infrastructure. And this is kind of like those basic building blocks that you need to be able to have kind of modern apps, modern service delivery in the way that we would expect them. And that people will talk about different configurations of what DPI includes. I think any version of that includes connectivity. Do you have, high bandwidth, easily available internet, which in urban areas in Canada we do. It's getting better in rural areas because of satellite internet, but we still have a very dispersed population in terms of certainly rural and indigenous and northern communities. And so there's a gap to catch up there. Can you do online payments? Canada's actually had online payments in some cases before other countries. And so I think we're reasonably well there in having some infrastructure. But the big one I think that we struggle with is digital identity or digital credentials. We don't have a national digital ID or digital credential. A lot of the countries you mentioned do have that.
I heard that we do actually have that, but nobody uses it because every department said, oh, no, we're special. Like there's a platform for it, but everybody I've talked to said, when it was first rolled out, people went, yeah, but I'm not going to use that for my department.
Right. And so regardless of whether there are, and a number of provincial governments have it. So I think there's two different issues here. One, within the federal government, do you have kind of a common login and credential? But then we've got just the structure of our government and our federated system. It's often the provincial governments who are the ones who kind of hold your identity records and are the keepers of that. Some provinces, I mean, British Columbia, I usually point to as being leaders in this, though I know, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and a few others have been doing some interesting pilots. But we've got a pretty fractured governance landscape when it comes to identity in Canada. And I think the fact that, we don't, like some of these other countries we might point to, have kind of your kind of single Canada card that you can plug into federal, provincial, municipal, private sector types of services. Until you have that, until you have a way to kind of verifiably prove who you are online, all this other stuff is very tricky to build in the kind of integrated way we want. And I just add, I mean, I think the other challenge we're in now is that digital identity has become a political conspiracy theory topic.
Yeah,
that's
such a huge issue. I mean, people, we went from, the government knows everything about you to don't let the government know who you are. Well, if the government already knows anything about you, shouldn't you want to log in and see it with your ID so you can find out what they know? It seems kind of ironic.
Yeah, and this is, folks from Estonia and from Denmark and other countries who've had these kind of systems in place for a long time will often point to that, which I think people here find surprising, is it's almost like the antidote to Big Brother. Yeah. It's not Big Brother itself, because in those countries, for folks who aren't aware, you can actually log in and see all the information the government has about you. You can see who's been looking at that information. There's actually kind of a backwards accountability trail from a citizen perspective. Whereas in Canada, yeah, we don't have a single system or a single database, but as a citizen, I have no real way to kind of know at a kind of a glance what government has. I have to file ATIP requests all across the board.
If you're a politician, isn't this a simple reframing? Shouldn't you just say, citizens should be mad that they can't see what government knows about them? We're going to build a system that lets every Canadian see every time a government employee touches their data. And oh, by the way, that's called single sign-on and digital identity. Like, yeah. It's not just a lack of imagination, it's a lack of framing. That seems like something that is widely supported from a nonpartisan view. Is just, you can almost use it's a bug into feature tactic from Just Evil Enough.
Absolutely.
You can use the mistrust as a way to build these systems.
I think a lot of those, a lot of the tactics you talked about in your book are exactly right. And it's not just tactics, right? Because when I say tactics, it makes it sound like we're trying to, we're trying to deceive people. It's really saying there are real benefits to this, and the dialogue around it has kind of gotten caught up, unfortunately. We're seeing it right now in the UK play out in real time, where the UK government has introduced, a new scheme to actually put in place a digital identity. They're getting a bunch of political backlash. This happened, David Cameron's government a decade plus ago went through kind of a similar thing. And so I think there's this, maybe kind of, I think the key point for this that I guess I want to get out of it, aside from digital identity as a topic, is we've kind of gotten to this point where political leadership has to be involved in this to kind of pave the way. Like, the public service has certain limits to how far it can push some of these issues by itself. Yeah. And I think, again, the countries we've seen be successful, they're successful because it's a full court press, right? It is the public servants, it is political leaders, it's the private sector, it's the media, it's not-for-profits, who are all kind of part of this conversation. I think in Canada, at least, this is kind of seen to be a technocratic issue, and it has not been at the forefront of the agenda in the way that I think it should be, because as unsexy as some of these plumbing issues are, if you don't fix the plumbing, none of the other stuff's going to get done in terms of social policy or economic policy.
Yeah, I posted something recently about how if you have a digital government service that can be fixed with AI, then your digital government service is broken. And what I meant by that was, let's say you're applying for a grant in Canada. There are literally hundreds of grants you can qualify for. They're hidden behind 60 different logins with 30 different usernames and passwords. If you say, I'm going to build an AI that's going to go apply to all those grants to see if I can get one, that just tells me that you needed to tell the AI everything you would have had to fill into a form anyway, because you got to get it the data to work with.
Yeah.
And then you're just telling it to go browse a bunch of things. Well, it would be much better if there was one form and then the government said, these are the grants you qualify for.
Yeah.
Now, the government may not want to do that because more people would apply for grants and get grants. In the same way with taxation, we underpay our most vulnerable Canadians, $1.6 to $1.8 billion a year, because in order to claim your benefits, you have to file your taxes. And people who are homeless and vulnerable don't file their taxes.
Yeah.
What do you think about the sludge here? The fact that if we don't modernize these things and make them hard to use, it's the same way that when a company does some kind of sweepstakes, they make it really hard to apply, so they don't actually have to give away all the prizes. Like McMillions, when McDonald's does the McMillions thing, I think in one case they had 21 Mini Coopers and only 8 were claimed. Because there's same thing with Hoover. This famous campaign where Hoover made it super hard to claim airplane tickets because they didn't actually want to pay out. Are we kind of getting to have our cake and eat it too by saying that we have this social safety net and then making it impossible to access?
My view is I actually don't think it's intentional. I don't. And maybe there are some cases where this comes up, but, because I think this argument does come up, right? About, is it kind of a feature, not a bug? You make it tough to apply because you're kind of artificially, controlling demand on this. I don't think that's true. And I think certainly from like political leaders, you hear this, I've heard this for years from all parties, right? People want people to be able to get access to the benefits that they've been owed, and they're frustrated when that doesn't happen. I think it is a whole bunch of well-intentioned people through a whole bunch of different chains in these systems who are layering on their own requirements and their own kind of viewpoint of the problem. And the challenge is, for the folks who are actually kind of putting together the application form, putting together the processing plan for it, traditionally, the voice of the person who was actually the one who needs to access it doesn't kind of show up in those conversations, right? And so you end up kind of building these Frankenstein forms that are meant to kind of, appease a whole bunch of internal stakeholders, but then the actual person they're trying to serve, it's unnavigable for them and they're unable to access it. And I mean, this is the whole, I think, thread of the last 10 or 15 years. I was trying to say, how do we bring kind of user research and user-centered design into government is very much about trying to, reframe how we think about that. And it's still as needed today as it was, 15 years ago when some of these digital services teams were first being set up in places like the UK and Australia and the US, and then later on here in Canada, where they were trying to bring some of these design practices that have been longstanding in Silicon Valley and in the tech world and say, how do we apply that to the public sector? Because I think you're exactly right. It's this burden we're putting on citizens or businesses or others who are trying to navigate this, and it can prevent often the most vulnerable people from being able to access it. I mean, that's why I think it's so exciting that we heard the announcement from Prime Minister Carney as a bit of a preview to what's going to be coming in the budget on November 4th. That automated tax filing, at least for low-income tax filers, is going to be a reality in the next year or two. And this is something that was first talked about, I believe, in the speech from the throne in 2020. So here we are 5 years later. It's going to be another year or two till it's implemented.
Yeah, and it goes back before that. There have been attempts to do it, but the CRA, in one case, we have a whole episode that we are recording with Alexandra McEachern and Paul Craig talking about exactly the path there, and it's unbelievable, especially the special interests from the tax lobby and the people who don't want the system to get fixed.
And to your point, yeah, and I mean, and Alistair, to your point about kind of Canadians understanding what the art of the possible is. So Denmark, which I believe was the first country in the world to put in place kind of an automatic tax filing system, I mean, they started doing this in the late 90s, right? Like this was, over 2, pushing 3 decades ago. So this isn't new stuff, right? This is us, frankly, catching up to where we should have been a decade or 2 ago.
We talked about digital public infrastructure and your concern that we can't just spray the AI on top of everything and hope it works. We have to fix some of the plumbing.
Yeah.
It seems like the other word that keeps coming up all the time, in addition to digital public infrastructure, is procurement.
Right.
We've talked to Dan Murphy. He's got some Mirko Kleiner. They got some great examples of what it takes to do digital procurement, agile procurement right. And there's lots of examples we can point at. ArriveCan is obviously a very visible one. But one of the things that did is, ArriveCan, I think people have forgotten, it was in a time of crisis. It was like, I'm not defending anything here, but you try to build anything in the first week of a pandemic and ship a new version every week for 18 months, things are going to be strange. The reality, though, is that put everyone on such high alert now that there's like an unnavigable amount of red tape. Yeah. And as a result, you go back to who am I going to get in the least trouble for buying from, as opposed to what is the outcome I want and who can deliver it. So where do you think procurement's going to get fixed? Is that a big stopgap as well?
It's going to have to, right? And I think procurement has been on the radar for years. And I think here in Canada, it's been much higher on the radar in the last couple of years, as you mentioned, because of ArriveCan and I think some other studies that were happening into looking at the procurement system writ large. And here's the challenge, right? I think at a fundamental level, what we should want as citizens and taxpayers and folks who work in the public service is a procurement system that gets us good outcomes, right? Like ultimately we want, government has to buy things, and it's going to buy physical things. It's going to buy, intangible things like software, and it's going to buy expertise in people, right? And this is always going to be a feature of government. I don't think any universe do we think government should be able to do all of this by itself. They'll probably should be able to do more of it than it can right now. But we've got a procurement system that is, in my view, and I've now kind of experienced this both when I was a public servant being on that side of it, and then for the last 7 years as somebody who works with government navigating procurement from the other end. We have a procurement system that is designed to focus on compliance as opposed to outcomes. And I like, to me, that's the fundamental disconnect, right? And kind of the aftermath of ArriveCan, and I think what I've certainly been seeing happening in the last year is departments are tightening down the compliance in terms of making sure every box is ticked and, every signature is where it should be. Fair enough. But I think you could have a world where every box gets ticked on those procurements, and you still have projects that are disasters, and you still have procurements that spend, millions of dollars that have very little value for taxpayers.
Well, it comes back to what we were talking about, waterfall. If you want to prove you are avoiding risk, you try and think of everything that could happen before it does, so that you've got it in the contract. And if you go in that route, then you're locking yourself into a path that cannot learn.
I mean, my much more radical proposal, which I feel like I should actually write up at some point and put out there, is I think we should actually be doing counterintuitively the opposite of what we're doing. Is we should actually make it much easier and faster to do small procurements, but then we should be radically transparent about the outcomes of those.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things, I'm very surprised by, as somebody, who provides services to government, I did it through my own company, we do it in the work that I do on learning now, is very rarely in any kind of procurement process are you actually adjudicated on the outcomes of the work that you did in the past, right? You're adjudicated on your ability to navigate an RFP process and, fill out a whole bunch of forms. I'd love to see the equivalent of like a Yelp for government, where when people work with vendors, they rate them, it's done in an open way, like at least internally in an open way. And so when you're going out there, you actually kind of have a bit of a track record, and you can bring people in quickly. And particularly for small, Canadian companies, there's a way to be able to engage them, where they're not going to have floors full of people who can respond to RFPs like the big multinationals will. And so we've kind of set up a system where we become, very dependent on people who are good at navigating the RFP process and the procurement processes, as opposed to saying we're going to get the best expertise in a flexible way. And so I think there's but that's I think at a political level, it's a tough argument to make, because people are always, there's no political cost to having more red tape for consultants. But,
the cynic in me says, I think in the last 20 years, the adversarial nature of politics in both Canada and the US and everywhere elsewhere in the world has been, you can bring down the government in power simply by criticizing it into incompetence. What I mean by that is, if you just shut down the budget negotiations, then the budget fails and they don't get to deliver. If I were the opposition to a political party and I just wanted to make them not deliver on their results, I would simply investigate and criticize every tiny little thing until the public servants became so terrified that they basically stopped functioning. And then I would take the party in power to task for saying you don't have a functional government. Yeah. That seems like such an easy way to just poison politics and not give people the services they need. I don't see both parties saying, you know what, or all the parties saying, you know what, this thing we're both going to agree needs to get done. We're just going to stop sniping. We're going to make it happen. Let's take some radical rethinking. Instead, they go find whatever fringe element is going to get them to yell in question time.
And you know what, I think the structure of our political system is opposition, I would say, is good in a way, because I actually do think, you need to have that function to kind of shed light. But I think you're right. I think it's gotten to a point where, for a lot of people too, it's a disincentive to want to get involved in public service. And whether that's public service of running for elected office, or public service of working within the public service itself as a civil servant, I think, that discord around it can be really challenging around it. And, ultimately, we need good people from all corners of society to come together if we're going to modernize how Canada works in the modern era. And so that dynamic becomes really tricky about it. But again, I think just to say that, there's a consensus, I would say, kind of, across society that things are not optimal. I think there's very few people. I would defy you to get somebody in the podcast who said everything's great and it's working the way it should. If you find them, great. I'd love to listen to that episode. But I think most people agree, something isn't working the way we'd like it to. And we're going to have to address some of those kind of base DNA issues of how government works in today's world if we're going to be able to get there, I think.
So if I can dive into nerdy metrics stuff
sure.
for a second. I love your idea of fast and simple procurement, radical transparency on the metrics. But when I look at data with the brain of someone who thinks a lot about analytics, it really seems like we cherry pick how we report data to avoid criticism. For example, in the passports, right? We have a metric in Canada that says 20 business days to get your passport. In 2024, between 81 and 83% of passport applications met that service standard, right? But if you say 90% of reports met the standard of 20 days, you don't know if the other 10% took 21 days, barely missing it, or 60 days, which is like a ruined trip. You don't know if the 90% that passed took 5 days or 19 and a half days. And you don't know whether performance is improving or degrading. And so it would be great if they said the average time to do a passport is X, or if you're a real nerd, the 95th percentile is X. But there's no incentive to go beyond this threshold, right? Like if you're 19 days and 5 days counts as good enough, why would you try to get better? Average times can be creeping along from like 10 days to 11 days to 12 days. Nobody notices until it hits 20, and then we freak out. And so it seems to me like even for the stuff we have data for now, we are not sharing that information in ways that allows us to understand the value we're getting from our government. That's got to be something that's changing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in that ability to kind of share data as a way to be able to drive performance and kind of change the incentives of the organization, right? And this is always kind of the challenge, I think, in the public sector versus, traditional private sector management techniques. Is in the private sector, you've got this kind of this gravity, this kind of physical law of your profit margins, right? And at the end of the day, if your company is not making money and it's not kind of leading to you, being able to keep your head above water financially, very clear success metric one way or the other. And lots of arguments about the harm of that.
The shareholders get quarterly updates that include a standard financial report.
Right. Yeah, right, exactly. I think there's a lot of harms about that being your only metric of success, but it's still a very clear metric that you have. In the public sector world, you lack sometimes that kind of clear gravity that kind of everybody's being pulled down from. And part of it is, I think, to be able to counteract that, to your point, is having things like being able to share, performance data like that publicly certainly kind of puts a much bigger spotlight on some of these things. Because I think we hear the anecdotal challenges and frustrations like the story you were sharing that people have, but it's tough to know systemically, like, is this kind of a common experience, or was it just me that had a bad one? And I guess the flip side is it's also sometimes tough to know when things are getting better. I think sometimes being able to have transparent, data around this lets us be able to say, hey, this is actually working. We can see an improvement around that. How do we able to actually focus on it?
So I guess this is a good topic to wrap on, because the purpose of the Functional Government podcast is to talk to people within Canada and see how systems are going, and then to go and talk to people elsewhere who fix those problems. And we've had some great conversations around taxation and identity and passports and all kinds of things that we can't wait to share. But it's been really hard to get people to talk. In fact, we've had people who have delivered incredibly good services, like really, really good, who went to their bosses to see if they could talk to us about it, and their bosses said no. I firmly believe that we fix things by talking about them. I firmly believe that every Canadian needs to know we do not have the government services we deserve, and that it's costing us money, it's undermining our sovereignty, and it's making us mistrust government because we have to navigate these things. And those are really bad problems. But we don't talk about this stuff. We kind of hope there's a genie of the AI lamp, and when we rub it, it'll suddenly fix government services. That's not what's going to happen. And so I guess what I want to know is, why does Canada have so much trouble working in the open compared to even other comparable jurisdictions?
I have been asking myself the same question for a long time, because I think there's something real to what you're saying and noticing there. And there's probably a couple of different explanations for it that I'm not going to pretend that I know what that is. Three things I'm going to point to that I think are part of the equation, at least. So one is, we don't have as big of a media ecosystem in Canada that looks at government, and in particular kind of how the public service and machinery works, right? And so if you look at the UK or Europe or the US or even places in Asia, there's a much kind of bigger media ecosystem that's actually looking at issues of kind of how government works. There's magazines and others that kind of focus on that. We don't tend to have as much as, literally a handful of reporters, I think, in the country who look at public service issues at kind of that level of detail. So there's
Why
not.
do you think that is? It is because most of our entertainment comes from the US, so we don't fund reporting that way?
There's probably an interesting case to be made. Yeah, I mean, the kind of cultural overlap, we get eaten up by being next door to the States. I think, we're a smaller-ish country and more.
Yeah, but I was in Berlin last week, and smaller population than Montreal, way better digital services, much more transparent dashboards for like every single train running on time, every single government service delivery period, whatever. So I don't really buy that argument. Like it's the data's there.
Yep. But so I think that's one piece of it. I do think there's a cultural element to it as well. Like, I think a little bit of our Canadian niceness, we I think are a little bit just inclined, not to rock the boat as fast or as much as others do. There's a little bit more of a rough and tumble, I think, kind of culture in some other places where they're more likely to kind of mix it up a little bit when it comes to that. And then I think the other piece of this is, we have a bit more of what I will kind of say is an insular public service than some other jurisdictions as well. Certainly compared to the US, where, you for better or for worse, you get a lot of people who cycle in with new administrations into, not just the very top levels of government, but actually fairly deep into the org structure. In Canada, it tends to be a lot more lifers going all the way up. And the plus side of that is you get stability from that kind of long service you have within the system. The downside is there can be much less incentive to rock the boat, right? Because if all the people you kind of come up with within the system, you all know each other, and there is less of kind of, number one, you can get a bit of a groupthink challenge, but two, there's just kind of a human nature challenge of you don't kind of want to push as hard. And I do think that is one of the things that we face here in Canada is certainly I see this at the federal public service, maybe less pronounced at provincial and municipal governments, but you get a lot of people who spend an entire career there. We don't have as good of a track record of cycling people in and out from other sectors. And even public servants who go out of government, and I'm an example of somebody who did this, there aren't a lot of easy paths to then bring your experience externally and bring it back into the public service. And I actually do think that's one of the challenges that as we think about public sector reform, I hope we can spend some time thinking about, and I hope government starts thinking about, is how do we bring different kinds of experience and talent and perspectives into government. And I know, this clerk, the newest clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Sabia, he's talked about this a little bit, about the importance of diversity of thought, right? To getting different kinds of viewpoints around the table. And so I actually think, in theory, we've got both a prime minister and a clerk of the Privy Council, the head of the public service in Canada, who both have had extensive careers outside of government. So they're probably well positioned to actually be sympathetic to that idea of how do we bring different types of talent into the public service.
Yeah, and I think we certainly have the cultural pressures and the economic pressures to get it right. So as Hillary Hartley said last year, never squander a good crisis.
Yeah, that's right.
So
exactly.
Hopefully we can make some changes. Ryan, as always, thank you so much. I cannot be happier to have you kick off the first podcast for the Functional Government Podcast. You're somebody who has been in and out of this and seen it from the days when it was just a gleam in eyes. And thank you for your service building these things both in and out of government. Can't wait to put together some more of these conversations and try and show people just how different Canada is from other countries.
Well, and thanks so much for having me here. I'm really happy that you are picking up the torch, so to speak, and running with this. I think these are conversations that we have to have. And certainly when I had started our Let's Think Digital podcast 3 years ago, it was because I thought we needed more conversations like this. I know you care about this deeply. I'm excited to kind of see how this series evolves. I will be clicking the like and subscribe button right away, and I encourage others to do that. And I think it's a really important time for us to be having this conversation. So thrilled to be here to kind of help kick that off, and really excited to see where this goes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.